make sure it's working before anything. Hey guys, so just checking that we're live. If you guys are receiving us, then give us a little comment in the chat so we know we're live and we can get going. Just waiting to see if any signs of life in the comments.
Life out there.
There's always a little delay. There we go. Yes, we've got some waves. We've got some highs. Excellent. Well then, in that case, I will get cracking. Hello and welcome to Working In with Heights, a series all about the most important organ in your body, your brain. Hopefully by now you've got a good chance to be working out at home, looking after the most important organ or your most important self, your whole body. But we believe that, looking after your brain by working in is just as important as working out for your body. Now, at Heights, we believe a healthier brain is the key to a happier life. And our brains are not something that we can see, so ironically, out of sight and out of mind. And they take up more energy than any other organ, and they're our operating system. But strangely, as a society, we just don't spend the time looking after them. And that's why we want you to schedule in our working in sessions every Thursday, making sure you book yourself into our Cranium Gymnasium with the world's very best mental fitness instructors. Now, at Heights, we're a brain health and mental wellness company. We make smart supplements specifically designed to help you optimize your brain and create clever content from some of the world's leading experts to coach you along on your journey. This Working In series is here to demonstrate how putting your brain first will help you take the steps towards reaching your heights, whatever they might be. Now, we have a moderator in the chat, as always, our amazing community manager, Emma. So when you ask questions in the comments, she's going to feed them into me, and we've got time in the breaks for Q&A in between each working in session, so we'll try and get them answered. Now, to set expectations, you're not going to get sweaty at a work-in. We're not going to sit in silence and do mindfulness exercises either, although I do know that James is a particular expert in those. Instead, these are about packing in as much actionable knowledge from world-leading experts as humanly possible and putting into simple language for you to take into your daily life. So even if you just add one thing from these sessions, it's still going to have a big impact on your mental health. So that's all from me. It's time to introduce today's mental fitness instructor, Dr. Robert James Doty. But after we met in London at an event last year and went for some drinks, it's Jim to your friends. So I think we can stick with that. Can we, Jim?
Absolutely, sure.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the show.
Yeah, I was so impressed with that introduction earlier. I wanted to come on and listen to the show.
Exactly. Well, as you know, you're a very formidable drinking partner, but today we're just going to be drinking water, especially as it's the start of the day for you. And actually, as you mentioned to me just before we were chatting, right after this, you're going into brain surgery. So taking off your suit and getting your scrubs on. But before we get started, your story is just so brilliant. Now, I think it'd be doing us a contextual disservice to your legacy to not just try and hear some of the high level. We don't usually do this with any guest because we want to learn what they have to say, not hear about your life story that we can get elsewhere, for example, from your best-selling book Into the Magic Shop. But seeing as we have a captive audience here, what's the quickest summary you've ever given of your own life? Do you think we can target 5 minutes?
Sure. So you know it, but very quickly, I grew up in a challenging environment. My father was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke when I was a child and was paralyzed, had a seizure disorder, and unfortunately was chronically depressed. And as a result of that depression, she attempted suicide many times. Throughout my entire life as a child, we were on public assistance, or I guess you call it over there, the dole. Neither of my parents had gone to college. So as you know, a child in that type of an environment, it's very challenging to have, if you will, quote unquote, success. There's something now called adverse childhood experiences. And we know children who grow up in environments where there's poverty, lack of education, drug and alcohol abuse, violence, mental illness. It has an effect not only on them mentally, but also physically. And it's as if you're in a war zone your entire life and you have post-traumatic stress disorder. So the question, of course, is how was I able to attend college, go to medical school, become a professor of neurosurgery at Stanford, found this center that studies the neuroscience of compassion and altruism at Stanford, developed relationships with the leading spiritual and religious figures throughout the world, including the Dalai Lama, who's the founding benefactor of the center at Stanford, as well as become a successful entrepreneur, and as you point out kindly, a best-selling author. And the basis of that change in trajectory of what would have been predicted happened when I walked into a magic shop. That's the title of the book. And what happened at that time, and which I think is very germane to our conversation today, is that when I walked in, the owner wasn't there, but his mother was there. And the extraordinary gift that she gave me at that time, and I was 12 years old, and scared, anxious, angry, filled with shame, was that she looked at me with a non-judgmental, radiant smile that embraced me and created an environment of psychological safety. And after a conversation where she asked me some penetrating questions, which I answered honestly, she said to me, you know, I think I could help you if you come here every day for the next 6 weeks, and she was there for the summer, I think I could teach you something. And lo and behold, I showed up, not because I had any particular insight, but because I had nothing else to do, and she was feeding me cookies. And I did show up, and during that period of time, over 6 weeks, I learned some extraordinary things that changed my brain and actually ultimately changed the trajectory of my life. And it had to do with learning a mindfulness technique. And imagine at that time, no one talked about mindfulness. It was this idea of breathing, relaxing the body, doing a body survey. And because you cannot learn, you cannot be present unless you can attend, and you have to be relaxed. You know, people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, they're always waiting for something to happen, so they can never really focus. So that was the first thing she taught me. And then she also taught me that the voice going on in my head that was telling me I wasn't good enough or smart enough was not real. I had always thought that when I said I'm not very smart, I'll never succeed, et cetera, I thought that that was truth, and it was not. And the very nature of that negative dialogue with myself was limiting me. And she taught me ultimately to recognize that and a technique to change that. And then when I recognized my own suffering and was compassionate with myself, I then realized that others are suffering, and that when you are able to deal with your own suffering and be self-affirming, recognizing you deserve love, nurturing, then you can give that to other people much more easily, because everyone is suffering. And once you do that, what I say at the end basically is, when I changed my view of the world and understood the nature of reality, if you will, the world changed how it saw me. And that fundamentally is why I was able to believe in myself and also to succeed at very high levels.
And without giving away any spoilers, you did mention you've had a career as an entrepreneur and as a CEO of a publicly listed company. You've had a lifetime of experience in business and medical, and now your profession. You are back to being a full-time neurosurgeon, correct?
Well, I bounce around from place to place. My wife says sometimes, she says, can't you just be a neurosurgeon? Uh, so, but yes, and it's nothing is a greater privilege than to be able to care for another person. And as physicians, and certainly as a neurosurgeon, that's an extraordinary ability to be able to help someone. And I certainly recognize that, and I feel very privileged that I've been allowed to do that.
And before we get into today's work in, one of the most compassionate things you ever did was give away all of your whole fortune. So can you just give us mere mortals some wonderful insight and inspiration into such a kind act?
Well, who we are today is a manifestation of who we were as a child, for good or for bad. And I had succeeded at very high levels, as I mentioned, going to medical school, becoming a professor, an entrepreneur, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing is that I was hoping all of that would make me feel better. And at the end of the day, here I was living in a penthouse, had Ferraris, Porsches, was flying around in private jets, and I had never been more miserable in my entire life. And the reason was that my actions, while they were helpful to people, and I never was mean or bad, but it was all about me. And my eyes suddenly opened again when during the dot-com crisis, I lost almost $80 million in 6 weeks. And I owed the bank about 15 million, and I was about 3 million in the hole. And so this, of course, would get one's attention. And essentially, in those situations, your banker becomes your best friend. So I had to liquidate everything. But it turned out I had taken some stock in the company I had run and put it in a trust to give away. And when I was sorting through all the assets and how I was going to pay all my bills, I met with my lawyers, and sheepishly, my lawyer informed me that his junior partner actually had not completed the transaction to actually give away all of the stock that I had committed. And I had the opportunity not to give anything away. And at that time, the company hadn't gone public. And after consulting with my friends about this, who all said giving it away was absolutely crazy, as did my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, I went ahead and gave every share of stock in this company that I had committed away to charity, and it had not gone public. And when it went public, it ended up being tens and tens of millions of dollars in the face of me being minus 3 million. Now, people say that was probably the stupidest thing you ever had done. But the reality was, at the end of the day, that gave me my liberation. Because looking back, what had been driving me was trying to prove myself that I was worthy, and trying to externally show through all of these different achievements that I deserved to be at the table. And while deep inside, I was still that scared child. And I recognized that all of the things that I did meant nothing if I wasn't secure inside. And in some ways, it's this idea about happiness doesn't come from outside. You have the ability to gift yourself happiness, and that's from internal work. And once I gave that money away, I was liberated because the monkey was no longer on my back. And actually, retrospectively, it was the greatest thing I ever did for that reason. Plus, I realized that, we talk about self-actualization, but what's most important is transcendence. And transcendence is when you recognize that there's no longer a separation between you and the other, but in fact, you're one. And that allowed me to make that bridge and redirect my life more directly to be of service and not it just be about me. Now, of course, that being said, if I'm a neurosurgeon, I do have a significant ego structure by the very nature of my profession. So I won't deny that, but I will assure you that most of my efforts are towards helping other people.
Including this evening. So that is a perfect segue into our first work-in. So we're going to talk about the science of compassion and what it does to your brain, if that's okay.
Sure.
So what happens to our brains? Talk to us about the science of compassion. What have you learned?
Well, I think to put it in the right context, I have to go back to our evolution as a species. And
well, you've got 15 minutes, so let's hope you can cover it super succinctly.
Absolutely, in 4 minutes. Our species, unlike other species, to have theory of mind, abstract thinking, and complex language requires our offspring not to run into the forest, but we have to care for them. And that caring takes a decade and a half or so. And that's an immense cost in resources, time, energy. So why would we do that? The reason we do that is when we care, when we nurture, we are rewarded. And these parts of our brain that are associated with reward and pleasure actually increase their metabolism when we do good acts for others. Additionally, what happens is we have this innate ability as humans to intuit people's microfacial expressions, body habitus, voice intonation, even smell to determine their emotional state. and we can recognize when someone's suffering. And so we are motivated at a very deep level to care for the other, especially in the context of what we call our kin and our kith, our family and our friends, or our tribe. What happens when you care? It's quite extraordinary. I mentioned these areas of reward in your caudate, in your insula. But the other thing that happens is these two parts of our nervous system that are within the autonomic nervous system also are affected. One part is our sympathetic nervous system, which is the flight, fight, or freeze response, which we're all familiar with. And the other, probably less familiar, is what we call our rest and digest system. And so what happens is when you are anxious, you're frightened, you're in pain, you stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. And while on a short-term basis, let's say when we were on the savannah in Africa, it worked great. You know, you saw a lion shaking the grass, you knew what it was, you ran away, and you either made it up the tree or you didn't. And then you went right back down to baseline. What happens, though, when in the modern world, many people are chronically stressed, and this has a huge deleterious effect on your health, because when you have the chronic low-level release of hormones and neurotransmitters, it affects your cardiac function, it affects your immune system, it results in the expression of inflammatory proteins, which are associated with a variety of diseases. It also results in the release of cortisol, which on a long-term basis also has a lot of negative physiologic effects. But the amazing thing is when you care, when you nurture, you can shift and go into the parasympathetic nervous system engagement, which is what we call, as I mentioned, our rest and digest, but it could be our tend and befriend system as well. Because when that is engaged, two things happen. The area in your brain that is associated with executive control or making discerning decisions is shut down when you're afraid, because you're in survival mode. When you're engaged in the parasympathetic nervous system, you have access to memories, you have access to prior experiences, and you can utilize that information to make much more thoughtful, discerning decisions. The other thing that happens is that your heart is affected. Something called heart rate variability increases when you engage the system. And when you do not have heart rate variability, that is associated with the highest risk of sudden cardiac death. Additionally, your immune system is boosted. There's a decrease in the expression of inflammatory proteins, and your cortisol levels go down. So when you shift these two systems, it's quite dramatic. And we are meant to function when we engage our parasympathetic nervous system. That is when we are healthiest. We can affect our health by consciously making this shift, but it does take some work and some exercise. And when you're able to do this, this area of your brain associated with the flight or fight response, the amygdala, actually shrinks in size, and these other areas will actually increase in size. And the analogy you made about a gymnasium or exercise is actually true. What we want to do is to build those muscles in your brain that are helpful to you in terms of your survival, in terms of your thriving, and let the others atrophy that aren't so helpful.
Okay, so what are some good exercises or practical ways that we can do that and exercise the right muscles?
Well, certainly one of the things you mentioned earlier, meditation or mindful practice, which of course was developed experientially over thousands of years by a variety of groups, especially Buddhists, but in other religions or philosophies as well. They have learned that when you're able to do a breathing exercise, when you do a mindfulness practice, if you will, when you do a compassion practice, it will shift you into this mode. And it's actually quite powerful. But you don't necessarily have to do that. If you, as an example, simply want others to thrive, if you can consciously express that in your mind about wishing others well, the very nature of that internal conversation also has an effect of that. The things that don't help you are when you are jealous, when you're angry, when you have envy, when you ruminate, about why this person got that and you didn't, then it has a very negative effect because it engages your sympathetic nervous system. It is a manifestation of fear, which leads to anxiety, which leads to increasing stress, and the spiral down ultimately into depression and potentially other significantly negative consequences.
It's a really interesting parallel here because, as you know, the other week we had Stephen Fry, one of your favorites, um, on the show, and we talked about the sinful brain, and it was a really interesting conversation. Obviously, he doesn't come at it from a neuroscientific point of view at all. But what actually happens to our brains then if we're wicked or unkind or uncaring? Is there some kind of, from a neurosurgeon's point of view, is there some physiological demonstration of that?
Sure. And, there are some exceptions to that because if you're a sociopath, you do not have the normal mechanisms which would regulate that. But certainly when people are not kind and it actually starts gnawing at them on a subconscious level, and it creates, again, all of the negative physiologic effects I mentioned, because when you're not good. And then every time you see that person, every time you relive that memory, it results in the same negative consequences. It's just like the opposite. If you were to have gone out and done an act of goodness for someone, not only do you get the immediate effect of that, but when you relive that in your mind, it shifts you over. And that's the wonderful power that we have within ourselves. I mentioned earlier this idea of self-compassion and telling yourself you're not good enough, you're not worthy, you're an imposter, et cetera, which is so common. And interestingly, primarily only in the Western world. The thing that happens there is that every negative statement you make, you give this immense power you have within yourself to change yourself and affect the outside world away. And I tell people that when I was in that mode all the time, it was as if I was laying bricks down to create a self-imposed prison, which became very dark, and it starts getting stifling because you can't move. And that is the metaphor for giving your power away. And when you can break out of that and you can see the light and you can see the power of connection, it changes everything. And it's very, very powerful. And as well as I do, and we see it around us every day, people who've been able to do that and achieve extraordinary things.
What do you think is your most impactful fact about kindness and compassion for our brain's health?
What will happen is if you live a life in that manner is that your telomeres will get longer. And there's a wonderful book by a Nobel laureate, Elizabeth Blackburn and Alyssa Appel, who wrote a book about this, whose title I can't remember at the moment. But in fact, we know that when you do these practices, when you're kind to other people, it actually is one of the best things for your long-term health. And in fact, practicing compassion, practicing kindness has more benefit than actual exercise or being at your ideal body weight. And to quote a very interesting study, this was done among volunteer women in Wisconsin, and it was a longitudinal study. It showed that those people over the age of 65 who volunteered a minimal number of hours had a 2x increase in life expectancy compared to those who didn't, with two exceptions. The exceptions were if they were not doing it authentically, meaning that they wanted reward or recognition. And so you can't fake it to make it. You have to really care.
Okay, before we go to questions, I just want to know what the 3 key lessons you want people to remember about this particular topic are.
Compassion, compassion, compassion.
Wow, that was easy. Well, we're going to give you some harder questions from the audience then. So, a question from Lois. She says, when we have those negative emotions, how do we guide ourselves back to mindfulness?
Well, I think what you have to recognize is that it's a false narrative, and also that you deserve to be loved. People get this belief that they've done X, Y, or Z, and as a result, they're not worthy of love. The other thing is that every person has a shadow, and it's that part of ourselves that makes us have shame. It's a part of ourselves many people try to push away. And the problem with that is you have to have radical acceptance of that shadow, then you can live with it. Because if you push it away and pretend it's not you, when you're at your weakest, when you're most defenseless, it pops out and it will harm you. And so I think that's a very important thing. No one is perfect. And, oftentimes we look at others and we go, look at their life. If only I had this. But having lived long enough and been in these situations, many of the people who I had this desire to be like, they just had the horrible, most painful lives imaginable. And so the other important thing is to have gratitude. So often people think about what they don't have versus what they do have. And if you understand that half the world's population lives on less than $2.50 a day, almost anyone listening to this is better off than half of the people in the world. And so you really have to put things in perspective and have gratitude. And it has a huge positive effect on you physiologically as well. And one of the greatest things you can do actually is journal about your blessings.
Okay, so the next question we've got is from Akash, who says, how do you inspire compassion in others?
Well, my limited experience has been, if you don't talk about it, but you do it, that's probably the best thing to inspire others. We'll often see religious people talk about what you're supposed to do, but they don't do it. I would prefer not to speak about anything, but by who I am as an individual, by the actions I take, by those who I care for, that is the greatest statement that you can make that will inspire other people. There's a saying the person of which I can't remember, but to sort of paraphrase it, it says, at the end of your days, the best accomplishment you can have achieved is if your children, after you pass, when they think of compassion, integrity, and values, they think of you.
Yeah, that's lovely. Okay, so we have a last question on this, and then we're going to go. I don't have time for any more. We're going to have to go on to the next one. This is from Mark, who asked, given what you just said about intuition of people's feelings, will the Zoom-based economy undermine this, do you think? It's a great question.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because if studies have been done, and I'm sure most of your listeners have heard of oxytocin, or the nurturing or caring or love hormone. If and this was a study I'm thinking of, was done with young girls and their mothers. If a child receives a text message, it does not have an effect on their oxytocin level. If they talk to them on the phone, they'll get a response. But the greatest thing is actually human connection. Now, it's interesting because there's an area of research I'm exploring right now utilizing virtual humans and artificial intelligence. And what's interesting is that if an artificial or virtual human or virtual friend is able to demonstrate the appropriate emotional response to you and have eye contact with you, and the language is such that it is reflective and sympathetic, you will have almost a completely normal response as if you were talking or with a regular human.
So, okay, so there's some work to do, but we can get closer.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is, the most important thing is, though, when you show emotion, when you show you're caring, when you're authentic, when you're open, when you show your vulnerability, as I just did with that quote, people connect with you. They want to be with you because it's very hard to fake that.
Agreed. Okay, Jim, time for our second work-in. We're going to be discussing the alphabet of the heart. So, might seem a bit confusing that a neurosurgeon is talking about the heart. So can you elaborate for us?
Well, we mentioned the title of my book, Into the Magic Shop, but the title is A Neurosurgeon's Quest to Discover the Mysteries of the Brain and the Secrets of the Heart. And what's interesting is, and we alluded to a little bit earlier, we're talking about the vagus nerve and the sympathetic and parasympathetic components of that. What's amazing is that your brain and the brainstem connects to the vagus nerve, which is distributed throughout all the organs in the body, and it's most prevalent in the heart, and it's a two-way street. And so your organs, and we're finding more and more about this every day, actually have a significant effect on your mental state and vice versa. The other interesting thing is, and I was talking about experiential learning as an example, compassion practices, mindfulness practices. When researchers early on were studying Buddhist monks, wanted to learn about compassion, they were using electroencephalography. And those are these things you put into your scalp to look at brain waves. And so, and many of your listeners, I'm sure, have seen the National Geographic or some of these photographs of a monk with this cap on. Well, when they went to this group of monks and they told them that they were studying compassion, they all started, and they were going to look at the brain waves, they all started laughing. And the reason they were laughing, they thought it was because this cap looked funny. The reason they were laughing is because they said, obviously, the scientists didn't know anything. Compassion comes from here, your heart, and not your brain. But getting back to your query about the alphabet of the heart, I had the incredible honor to be asked to give what we call the white coat lecture. And in the United States and some universities abroad, there's a ceremony when students are about to start medical school where they are given a white coat. They take the oath of Hippocrates or some other oath. And then in theory, there is a inspirational speaker who epitomizes the highest ideals of medicine. I made that up, but I think it's true. And I was that person. And I was really trying to think about what is it in my own personal journey that would inspire these kids, and also what is it that was something that they could easily remember. And after a period of reflection, I came up with what's called the alphabet of the heart. And you have to remember, medical students have to remember immense amounts of information about anatomy and other things. So what I came up with was 10 letters, C through L, and I will share them with you. And then I'll tell you a very interesting story about those. So C is to have compassion for self and others. D is recognize the dignity of every person. E is practicing equanimity. And this is this evenness of temperament in the face of changing situations. You know, so many of us, when we have achieved or accomplished something and when we receive accolades, we want to hold on to that feeling and have it repeated over and over. But this isn't the nature of life. And all of us will have down times. And while they're painful, retrospectively, once time passes, those are usually the times that we have demonstrated our greatest resilience and when we have gotten the greatest wisdom. But having an evenness of temperament, how you function in these different situations, is critically important. F is forgiveness. When you carry memories of anger and hostility towards another, while you think that that's doing something, it certainly has no effect on the other person whatsoever. And in fact, in some ways, it's like swallowing poison and somehow thinking it's going to affect the other person. It has a very negative effect because what happens is memories are not a photograph of the event. Memories are a photograph that are painted with emotion. And every time you look at that photograph, the emotions occur. And obviously, they're not pleasant and they're not good. And negative emotional states have a horrible, horrible effect on your physiology. So, forgiveness, and it's not to forget, it's simply to be able to go forward in your life. And G is having gratitude, which I mentioned in our earlier session. Again, so many of us, we forget how blessed we are when in reality, if you think about half the people living on less than $2.50 a day, we are very blessed. But we have a tendency to look up at others because we have a conspicuous consumption society and a capitalistic society that creates this need to have more and more and more, thinking, and as I said earlier, which I believed, if I got more of this, I'd be happy. If I had more of that, if I did one more thing, if I accomplished this, I would be accepted, I would be looked up to. And the thing is, the emptiness we have is only filled when we care for others. All the external things in the world are meaningless and will keep that empty hole there. And when you finally recognize that and you finally sit there and say, it's not about me, I'm here to be of service, I care for others, suddenly you are full. Suddenly you feel the energy of the world, you feel the connection with everyone. And so G, gratitude, H, which is I'm avoiding, is because it's for humility, which is very hard for a neurosurgeon.
And best-selling author.
And best-selling author, right.
Yeah, exactly. Just skip right over humility.
But the thing is, though, that it is critically important that, so many people will look at another suffering and they'll come from the perspective of I'm superior, which is pity, or sympathy, which is on a cognitive level, you see their suffering, but you're not feeling it. And humility is a recognition that that person is no different from me. We are equal, period. And it's like dignity. Each of us deserves recognition of our dignity. I is having integrity and values. J is justice, if you will, or a sense of fairness, or for us who are blessed, our absolute responsibility for those who are vulnerable. K is simply kindness, doing an act towards another without expecting any benefit, and they don't even have to be suffering. And all contained by L, which is love. And I use that as my own personal practice. Every morning I sit up, I do a breathing exercise, very short. I think
how short is very short?
About 3 seconds. No, it's probably 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, I mean that's still encouraging for everyone, because obviously we hear from gurus all the time. You're like, oh, I'm not going to meditate for an hour, but 3 minutes, that sounds doable.
You don't need to meditate for an hour. You need to care 24 hours. That's the key. But do a breathing exercise that shifts you. And then I sit with a smile, having gratitude and awe about the world. And then literally I go through that alphabet, and that sets my intention for the day. And I've been doing that for many years. If I can tell you a very quick story, do we have time?
We please go for it.
Okay. The interesting thing is I gave that talk and it got a standing ovation. The other half of that talk, actually, the way it ended, which led to the standing ovation, was I ended it by saying, you have, and this is to the medical students who are starting, you have sealed your path with an oath. It will take you to life's deepest and darkest valleys. You will see what disease and trauma can do to a fellow human being. Sadly, you will see what one human is capable of doing to another, and most sadly, what one human is capable of doing to themselves. But it will also take you to life's highest peaks, where you will see the weak demonstrate strength you thought not possible, where you will see cures for which you can find no explanation, and where you will see the power of love and compassion to cure disease. And by doing so, see the face of God. So that was the end of that. But a few months later, a woman sent me an email, and that was publicized or put on the internet. A woman sent me an email and she said, I'm the spiritual director of the largest homeless shelter in the United States. I'm a person of faith. And she said, I had been overcome my work. I was burned out. I had resigned. My friends had given me scripture. On my last day at work, as I was packing my box, someone shared with me your talk, and it gave me the power or the strength to return to work. And I'm going, oh my God, I was so moved by that. So then what happened is I wrote back to her, of course. 2 months later, she sends me another email and she says, we've started this practice with the clients at the homeless shelter. It's very powerful. And again, I'm overwhelmed. Sends me another email. Now she's officially a stalker. And she says, I shared your story with my dear friend, and she has a 9-year-old daughter, and her daughter makes beads. And she said, on her own, this young girl who's 9 at the time, named Jenny, she made a set of beads, wooden beads, one representing each of those 10 letters. And she had a golden bead to represent the golden rule. Would you mind if we sold that as a fundraiser for the homeless shelter and the peace center that we have? And I was very moved, and I said, absolutely. Then a few months later, she sent me another email, and she said, this has stayed with me so much that I made a video, and it's called Compassion Beat San Antonio. And it shows this little girl's hands on this golden cloth, and she's stringing these beads, and this woman is narrating and going through this whole practice and what each bead means. And Dan, I know we've talked about this. See, here's a set of beads. I'm going to throw them to you through the...
Amazing. Incredible. I can't believe that works so well. And they say that we won't be able to have hugs and compassion through Zoom when you can pull off magic tricks like that.
And so the extraordinary thing, those are now sold around the world. And what's even amazing to show you the rippling effect of compassion and kindness, there's a high school student who then made an app that you can find on your iPhone or Android app store, which is free, called The Alphabet of the Heart. And it's used for kids who are experiencing stress and anxiety in high schools. And in fact, there's actually a discussion about creating a TV series utilizing those 10 letters to tell different stories at different times. But and for your listeners, if they're interested, you can go to the website for the book, intothemagicshop.com, under podcast. And one of my students from Brisbane, he and I did a 12-part series talking about the science, the neuroscience behind each of those letters, why it was chosen, and how it will affect you physiologically when you actually use this practice.
Amazing. Okay, Jim, we have some questions. I'm going to just pick two because we've got a lot and we've got one more work in to get through. So I've got a question from the Derry Girls, which is, how do you cultivate compassion for someone who has hurt you, and do you need to forgive them?
Yes, you need to forgive.
I thought you might say that.
That's not to forget what they did to you. It's not to let them hurt you again, but it's not to let them control you forever, because you need to liberate yourself from those negative feelings. So I think that's really important. And remember, and this is what so often we forget, we think that other people's actions are about us. And oftentimes how somebody comes on to us negatively actually has nothing to do with us. It could be related to an experience they had with another person an hour earlier. It could relate to a health issue. But, when people hurt others, when they do bad things, oftentimes there's an underlying reason. It's like bullies. Bullies inflict pain because they're in pain. And if you really spent time with a child or someone who's a bully, you understand oftentimes behind that facade, there's a crying child.
Totally agree. Right, I'm going to ask you to keep some of these answers succinct because we've got so many questions. I do want to get through some of them. Okay, from Oliver, many teachings in the business landscape focus on tenacity and dog eat dog. This isn't in line with compassion. Where does compassion sit in the business world and pushing yourself to success?
Well, eating another dog is not compassionate. So I would say, no, it does not. And in fact, what's extraordinary at this time is that in a capitalist society where you have quarterly earnings like on Wall Street, oftentimes there is this aggressiveness to meet expectations. And there are some leaders who have gone from the perspective of, I have to create fear to motivate my employees. But study now after study has demonstrated that that does not work. In fact, what works better than anything else is actually creating a compassionate environment. And let me give you an example. Google did a study where they spent $50 million. They're an analytics company, as you know. And when they first started hiring people, it was the top 5% of 15 universities, because, of course, the founders were that way. And they thought, of course, that is the criteria for leadership and success. I would never have been employed at Google, I will assure you, based on my own background. That being said, they did this study after they acquired several companies. Many people, the new employees, were not from that type of a background. What did they find? They found that the most successful teams, the most successful leaders had the following. They created a non-judgmental environment of psychological safety. They created an environment where every individual could be authentic and express themselves. They created an environment where people were not afraid to fail. And what did grade point average or what school you went to have in relationship to success of a team? Zero, nothing. Domain experience had little to do with success of a team. The fundamental criteria here is being authentic, being caring, making people feel good. And you know that I could have answered that question in about 2 seconds and saved them $50 million, or I would have done it for 5.
But you know, I asked you to answer it succinctly, and you couldn't handle that with me. So I'm not sure I believe you right now. Right, we're gonna skip one last question because we'll save some for the end because I do want to cover this last one, which is all about manifestation and neuroplasticity, which I know is a topic we both love. As you know, our Chief Science Officer, Dr. Tara Swart, who kicked off our Working In series, I introduced you to because you are researching a book in the space and you'd wanted to chat to her. So I think the audience is already familiar with the high level, but it's actually not something we talked about in her work in. So I'd love you to take us through neuroplasticity and manifestation. Off you go.
Sure, in a succinct way. Well, the extraordinary thing is that, and I was talking about our own internal power to change things, and in some ways that has to do not only with neuroplasticity, but actually the plasticity of our body. We can overcome and heal so many things. But specifically in regard to what you're saying is the lesson that this woman in this magic shop, one of the last lessons she taught me, and her name was Ruth, was how do you manifest your intention? And one of the things she taught me was actually utilizing every technique of our senses to make a list of what we wanted, to read it aloud so you hear it, to use your eyes to read it and input it, then to actually put yourself in the mindset that you have accomplished that. How would you feel? What would that look like? The interesting thing is that we as a species have, based on all of our sensory input, have about 3 million bits per second coming in. We are only able to process 50 to 100. So we ignore tons of stuff. It is the ignoring that results in us not taking advantage of certain opportunities or manifesting things sometimes. What do I mean by that? As an example, if you were at a party and you heard your name spoken of, even far across the room, you would immediately turn. Okay. I have patients who come to see me and I'll tell them a diagnosis and they'll say, "That's amazing, doctor. I've never heard of that before." I'll see them 2 months later and they'll say, "That's amazing. And I've run into 5 people who have the same thing I have." Well, why is that? Because it's been placed in their subconscious and now they're attuned. They're out of that 50 to 100, one of those is attuned to things that might relate, connect to, or cause you to turn. And that's one of the best ways you can manifest. That's the technique I just mentioned of writing it, doing it, is to get it into your subconscious mind so it sits there. And then all these things are happening around you, which you were ignoring. But once it's there, you are attuned to it. You know, the other thing that we can see as an example to show you how powerful we are, you know, of course, probably Wim Hof, the fellow who does the breathing and he walks around in the ice. You know, that's an incredible mental practice he's developed that is aligned with his own genetics on some level because he is so far above so many people. But it's what monks do, right? A monk can change their body temperature. They can change their heart rate. I can do that myself because I spent years practicing. And so we just have to understand that that power is truly in us to manifest these things. As another example, if you look at hypnosis, right? Uh, you can do extraordinary things. You watch somebody who is a hypnotist have these effects on people where they make them rigid as a board. Well, you can actually get that power within yourself. It is sitting there. You just need to have access to it, and it takes power. Another example is the placebo effect, right? I mean, you can give someone a medication if they believe it's going to have an effect on their blood pressure. In a remarkably high percentage of cases, it will. And again, how is that any different than you simply telling yourself that? The difference is you have to believe. And once you're able to get access to that, to believe these things, to visualize them, what happens is that, again, is the example of somebody who has a newly diagnosed condition. You start running across people because you're much more attuned to what is happening around you. And I think that's one of the most important things about manifestation. The other reality, and one of the things I've certainly learned, is sometimes we have a tendency to dismiss people who we think aren't that important. Okay? I'm sure you've probably been to a party, maybe not you, because you're very important and good looking, but I've
never been to a party, I thought you were going to say.
Never invited. You've crashed
Yeah,
several.
exactly. Yeah.
No, but have you ever been to a party and somebody walks up to you and you shake their hand, but they're actually looking over your shoulder at somebody else because you're not really that important in their mind? It's a horrible feeling to have, actually. But, I tell people some of the greatest experiences, some of the greatest opportunities I've had is being the same with everyone. Because, there are people who may be in the most humble position, who have some of the most incredible wisdom, and also people who you discard or take for granted who actually have extraordinary connections you can't even imagine. And so many things in my life have happened because, and it gets back to the alphabet of the heart, recognizing the dignity of every person, having humility, and being there regardless. And I think that's a very, very important lesson for all of us to get what we want, but also to connect. And again, some of the greatest gifts I have been given is because I reached out and was kind to somebody.
And it's interesting because I always talk about people ask me what my belief system or principles are, and I say that I'm spiritual and I actually just believe in serendipity. That's a very similar, the way you just described it is basically how I would describe serendipity, which is totally to be there present in the moment and believe in the worthiness of the moment you're having with someone else, and believing that that can create magic for the rest of your life. That is ultimately what I mean by creating serendipity. It's just having the total confidence that that moment is special.
And you have to have an openness, right? It's mentioned, you were mentioning that you're spiritual. People ask me what my religious belief is, and I usually use the Dalai Lama quote, "My religion is compassion." But I'm an atheist. What's interesting, though, is there probably no one else in the world who has relationships with more spiritual and religious leaders than I do, living ones, whether it's Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Sadhguru, the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, the Pope, etc. And people say, well, how's that even possible that you seem to connect with these people? And the reason is an evolved spiritual being, the dogma is no longer relevant. The only thing these individuals are interested in and that they can intuit in a microsecond is whether you have an open heart, whether you care, whether you give love. And if you can walk in the world in that place, you will be pretty much accepted almost everywhere and immediately held in high honor and loved.
And actually, to that point, I'm assuming, manifesting that you want to meet the Pope is a pointless reality. You're better off manifesting to be kind and compassionate to all, and it's more likely to get you to that other end goal.
Well, and that's exactly right. You hear people say, well, I want to have money and I want to have this. And the thing is, if you lead a life of compassion and caring, usually you will be able to thrive and maximize your potential. When it's all about attachment to a goal, this is what typically creates unhappiness. It's attachment and not getting what you want. The goal is wonderful. It's attachment to the outcome that creates problems. It's also trying to avoid acceptance of reality. As an example, the pandemic. Running around trying to push it away and think it doesn't exist creates heartache. When you finally accept it, it is the way it is. We're going to be in shelter in place. Then things change, because once you're accepting, then you can deal with it. As long as you're pushing it away, you haven't accepted it, and that causes a lot of unhappiness. So it's sort of, in some ways, it's the attachment. In some ways, it's resistance, but it's two sides of the same coin.
Okay, so can you, to wrap this up before we go to questions, can you give us your top 3 tips then for cultivating and manifesting a neuroplastic brain?
Having a clear set of intentions, using all of your senses to remind yourself of what they are at least once or twice a day, having an openness, and leading a life of compassion and caring, because more people will reach out to you and help you when they sense you actually care versus wanting something from them.
Completely agree. Okay, fantastic. Right, we're going to go to some of our questions if we can, please, Jim. John says, do you think recent events will help us appreciate others and be more compassionate? I wonder what we could do to try to sustain a more compassionate culture.
Well, someone said, we're all in the same storm in the ocean, right? But the reality is we're not in the same storm, or we're all in the same storm, but not everybody has the same boat. As an example, you saw David Geffen on his $450 million yacht complaining about his isolation, and you see somebody with a leaky life raft that's sinking. But the reality is there was this storm. And as much as you try to avoid, the reality is you can still sink in this storm, which does demonstrate that all the wealth in the world, all the privilege, does not stop reality from taking hold. Now, the ultimate reality is our death. And some people avoid that until the very end. And I will assure you, at most people's death, they're not figuring out how much money they had in their bank account. Most of the people at that point wish they had been more generous, more kind, more thoughtful, and also realized that the things that have made us angry, the things that have separated us from others, were meaningless. And the only thing that survives, and getting back to that exact quote I said earlier, at the end of the day, you wish for transcendence. This is the connection to oneness, if you will. And what you do want to have, though, hopefully, is a memory of yourself, which oftentimes lives through your children or others. And that memory should be that when people think of love, kindness, compassion, integrity, that you're the person who comes to mind. If you can do that, if you can be generous, you've led a good life. Sadly, so many people keep grasping and thinking they need more and more. I have a 100-foot yacht, I need a 150-foot yacht. And it's sad. And these people don't understand, because you see they have this emptiness that persists, and so many people, they believe, look up to them because they want that, with the same false narrative in their head that's going to make them happy. But that emptiness is always there, and that's why they have to keep grasping. It's the Tibetan mythology of the hungry ghost. The only thing that satiates that hunger is connection, love, compassion.
And besides, we're all perfectly happy with your 100-foot yacht that you're going to invite us on after this. So, we're satisfied.
150 feet, and you can all come. We'll have a big party.
Okay, so question from Melissa, who's actually my wife. So, it'd be rude if I didn't ask this one. She wants to know, how can you help educate someone very young on how to have more self-worth and cope with anxiety or PTSD?
Well, that's difficult, on some level. Sometimes it's inherited, which makes it a challenge. I think certainly breathing exercises helps calm the mind. I think trying to train emotion regulation. And I think also giving insights, and even young children can appreciate that uh, if you talk about why people do things that oftentimes other people are hurting, I think can be very helpful. And also, an animal can help, connecting to an animal.
Mm.
Even a toy sometimes can help. In fact, there's some new technologies. Actually, there's one called Moxie, Moxie, and one called Kintsugi Hello, which are actually robotic dolls that actually are completely designed to help children with anxiety and fear. And so I think some of the new technologies that are being developed could be helpful to that. But I think just as important is love, caring within a family, support, being there, and setting the best example you can.
Great. Okay, so question from John. I think it's a great one. Is there a neurological distinction between performing a positive action compared with the positive use of language?
Fuck, that's hard.
Right.
A positive. Now say that again. Can you read it?
Sure. Do you think recent? Sorry, no, sorry. Is there a neurological distinction between performing a positive action compared with the positive use of language? I don't think fuck was his example of positive use of language, but he got you into a brain twist. So good on you, John.
Uh, well, certainly, I think the language we use in and of itself can be a positive act, right? And so I think that in some ways they're equivalent. The other reality actually is that the mere act of, let's say, thinking you're about doing an exercise, a physical exercise, stimulates that area of your premotor cortex, and actually your muscles can enlarge. So the thought of doing positive things or utilizing language to make that connection, I think can probably have a very similar effect. Again, it's like meditation, getting your head in that space is simply utilizing the tools that you have to affect your physiology.
Makes sense. Okay, Jim, we've got a phenomenal quote to end with, but I'm going to save that for after my outro so that you stay tuned. You're going to enjoy this one. So just to wrap up, guys, thank you very much for attending this week's Work In. And Jim, thank you for attending your very first Work In. We definitely appreciate it. So we'll be following up with an email covering the key takeaways from today's session with Jim. It'll be landing in your inbox tomorrow. It's definitely possible the email might hit your promotions folder. So do look out for it, mark it as safe, and go from there, because you're going to want that wisdom in your inbox from Jim. Now, next week is Mental Health Awareness Week, and the theme is kindness, something that we've heard all about this week very appropriately. We're very honored to have the London-born but globally popular internet sensation Jay Shetty, who makes wisdom go viral, with us, who's going to be discussing wisdom, kindness, and relationships with the brain. To finish, we want to share a neuroscientific fact that is going to help you remember what you learned and help us reach more people, which is if you read or watch something, you learn it once, but when you share it, you learn it twice, connecting and building new neural pathways. So please do go on social and share one thing that you learned today and something that you didn't know before, and tag at your heights in the post if you can. We'll retweet and reshare some of our favorite lessons. We wish you all a lovely week ahead. It's almost time to clap for the NHS if you're tuning in from the UK. So with that, thank you very much to Jim, and we're going to leave you with a quote from definitely a fan over here, Jim, which is from Mark, who says, "Jim is like Yoda, but backed by science." What do you think about that?
Well, actually, that's a wonderful compliment. It's better than Jabba the Hutt.
It is. Jim's science backed by like yoga, he should have said. But anyway, thank you very much, Jim. It's been a pleasure.
And if anybody does have any questions, they can send them directly to me if they would like. Jr. Doty, Doty at Stanford.edu. And also, if there's anything I can do to help you, if I can, I will certainly try. So you take
Amazing. And he means it. Thank you so much, Jim. Have a lovely morning and you're off to surgery. So good luck today.
Yes, I'm 4 minutes late. I have to.
Okay, off you
Guys,
go. Thank you so much.
see you.
Thank you, everyone.